Welcome and thank you for waiting. All participants will remain in a listen-only mode for the duration of today's webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to your host from the U.S. Census Bureau, Erlene. Erlene, you may begin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the July Local Employment Dynamics, or LED, webinar. Before I introduce today's speaker, let's go over a few housekeeping rules. As mentioned earlier, this webinar is being recorded. For your convenience, it will be uploaded to our Census Academy site with all supplemental materials relating to the webinar within 30 business days. We welcome your questions during the webinar. Please submit your questions using the Q&A panel, which is located at the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. Once you've found the Q&A panel, make sure you choose all panelists from the drop-down menu. This will ensure we see your question. As time allows, we will answer your questions directly through the Q&A panel, or we will share your questions with the presenter to respond to during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Also, we ask that you do not include any personal or business identifiable information with your questions. We suggest keeping the chat panel open as we will provide key links and other resources through the webinar. Keep in mind, you won't be able to respond to the chat. That is for us to send out links and other resources related to the presentation. As you know, we are in a virtual environment and sometimes technical difficulties might occur. If you are having issues, try a different browser or consider logging out and coming back into the session. If you are having audio issues, try selecting the computer audio or calling into the webinar via phone. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the Local Employment Dynamics Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information, it is my pleasure to welcome Kenan Fikri as he presents Persistently Poor, Left Behind and Chronically Disconnected. Our presenter will explore how commuting patterns at the local and tract levels reveal the extent to which a place is disconnected from the progress of its neighboring areas. Using the Longitudinal Employer-Household Dynamics Origin-Destination Employment Statistics, or LODES data, which provides detailed statistics on the flow of workers between home and work tracts, he uncovers patterns of economic isolation and connection. Kenan Fikri is a senior fellow at EIG and a leading scholar in economic geography and development. In his role, Kenan adds the research department in helping policymakers and the public better understand how the U.S. economy is evolving and what it means for people and places. Kenan is a proud alumnus of the U.S. Department of Commerce, the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program, and the World Bank Group. He holds his master's in local economic development from the London School of Economics and his bachelor's in international relations and economics from the American University. With that, I welcome Kenan.
Thank you, Erlene, and thanks very much to the LED team and the entire Census Bureau for all the tremendous work that you all do. And thank you for inviting me here today to present some of my most favorite work, and I think it's some of the most meaningful work I've done too, and hopefully really interesting for this group. The material I'm going to present today comes from a paper that was in the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy, and Society, which last year had a really great 2-volume set of issues around left behind places, what they are, who lives in them, why do they matter, and what do we do about it. So for anyone who wants to go in deep, I really encourage you to check out all the different pieces in there, because it's a really phenomenal compilation of work. And what I'll present will show you how the LED and the LODES data can really be integrated into a much broader kind of analysis and overview of conditions in left behind and persistent poverty areas. So the motivations behind this work are, manifold. It starts with how do we create a more opportunity-rich American economy for all Americans, right, including those including and especially those who have been left behind in the near term, and left behind in the long term, and left behind for generations. But as an economist too, and a social scientist, I was also really intrigued by this observation that places have a much harder time climbing out of poverty than individual people do. So what is it that allows poverty to perpetuate in space for so long, and influence, and often to the detriment of the lives of the people who are subject to kind of concentrated, persistent poverty for long periods of time? But if you look just at the individual level across the U.S. economy today, according to Census Bureau data, only 2.2% of the total population experienced chronic poverty. And this came from census analysis that looked at individuals over the 2013 to 2016 period. How many were in poverty for that entire period? It was really just 2.2% of the total population. Far more, over a third of the population experienced short spells of poverty during that period. So put those two figures together, and you get kind of our more standard 11 to 15% poverty rate annually that we see from census statistics. And then the median spell below the poverty line lasted around 11 months for the typical individual who did experience poverty in that window. And I just put this out there to baseline. I think that the poverty rate has its shortcomings in fairly characterizing disadvantage and material hardship in the U.S. today, but it is a very useful benchmark of people who kind of definitely fall below the floor that we hope society puts below all of us. If you look at places, however, and here we're going to define persistent poverty as places that have registered a poverty rate of at least 20% for at least 3 decades. We have 400 U.S. counties that it's about 13% of all counties are persistently poor, and about 13.5% of all census tracts are persistently poor. And it's really important to not just look at the county level when we're trying to understand the geography and the demography and the impact of persistent poverty, because counties can mask multitudes. There are some counties like Cook County in Illinois, home to Chicago. It's one of the most populous counties in the country. Itself, it's not persistently poor. It doesn't register that high of a poverty rate, but it's home to 2 of the biggest census tract level concentrations of poverty in the country, each housing about 200,000 people. So obviously that is, the south and west side of Chicago are operative and representative geographies of persistent poverty in the United States, but they're completely invisible to kind of a policy or research radar set to detect persistent poverty only at the county level. So this chart shows the population in kind of each bucket in persistent poverty areas. So you end up realizing that if you look at census tracts instead of counties, it's not just 20 million Americans who are living in persistently poor places. It's 34 million Americans, so over 10% of the population. And you really see that you get this much more refined picture and see a graver condition in metropolitan areas where you get a lot more people living in persistent poverty census tracts. In non-metropolitan and rural areas, counties and tracts, they capture some different places, but generally the same number of people. And then the Northeast and especially the Midwest are regions where, in the West are regions where looking below the county scale is especially important. And in the West, think Maricopa County, Phoenix, or Los Angeles County, California. These are massive counties, so you really do need to look at the census tract level to identify persistent poverty areas. And if you start to dig deep, this map, any polygon, so any county shaded, is a persistent poverty county, and then any circle represents clusters of census tracts that are persistently poor. and those are sized by the population of those areas. So you end up, having a much more complete and refined geography of persistent poverty, but also, dig deeper and start splicing in the demographic data. It really becomes clear that wherever persistent poverty exists in the United States, it is inseparable from the history of a particular group in a particular place. So persistent poverty is living history, and persistent poverty is really the living history of particular groups in particular locations that have suffered from, systemic, decades-long, really deep and multidimensional disadvantage. And the point of bringing in this demographic data, isn't to generalize who's poor in which locations. Obviously, there are diversity within each bucket, but at the same time, you don't want to deny, how intrinsically connected these histories and identities are in understanding why poverty exists where it does today and why it is perpetuated for so long. So if you look at African Americans in the rural South, if you look at Caucasian populations in the Appalachian and Ozark regions, or general Hispanic populations in the Central Valley of California or along the Texas border, and of course Native populations all across the country, you really start to understand, how overlapping these conditions are. So this work in this paper is, it's descriptive in nature, and this was a commentary, right? It wasn't empirical work, or wasn't pushing the frontiers of advanced econometrics, but it's born from, this thesis or this assumption that places can only really remain in a state of persistent poverty when enough economic and social ties break to effectively disconnect them from the broader economy. So this thesis and this statement is really born out of faith in the immense, sometimes miraculous power of the American economy to offer opportunity to people and to, set a floor below people and places who have sufficient, ties and stakes kind of in the economic whole or in the economic mainstream. And, economic theory suggests that multiple forces should drive convergence over time in chronically struggling, left behind or persistently poor areas. One, outmigration. People do vote with their feet and try to, if they're able to, they often move to opportunity. So you would think that over time that could lead to an equilibration of for persistently poor areas that they may be able to stabilize. Also, government transfer programs. We do have a generous welfare state. We have a number of programs that try to help people and, again, put a floor underneath their well-being so that people don't face material hardship and deprivation. And there are also labor and other cost differentials. Persistently poor workers in persistently poor parts of the country are in regions where the prevailing, wage is generally lower than it is in areas that may be thriving, and the cost of doing business may be lower too. So you could, theory would suggest that over time, economic activity could migrate to these places and then help them develop and reintegrate into the U.S. economy. So the thesis is that disconnection, chronic and multidimensional, and we'll get into more of that in a moment, interrupts kind of these natural ameliorative economic processes that you would think help interrupt this cycle or the perpetuity of poverty and would allow places to climb out. So disconnection, believe prevents convergence that we might otherwise hope or assume to see. And we think that disconnection is more than just an economic phenomenon. It's social, it's cultural, it's geographic as well, and gets us to the point that persistent poverty is a state of multidimensional disadvantage. So how do we measure disconnection? How do we kind of test this hypothesis? There are a couple different ways that I look at it, and I'm sure I would love to talk about with people about more ways that you could look at it too. But one, kind of at its simplest, you can think of administrative disconnection. In some parts of the country, we see that persistent poverty areas here, persistent poverty census tracts are shaded in blue, and then municipal boundaries are the light gray lines. We see that persistent poverty areas really follow municipal boundaries, and in some ways, persistent poverty, and in some places, persistent poverty can be coterminous with city or municipal boundaries, suggesting that these invisible jurisdictional lines may play a role in perpetuating poverty on very localized scales. And we can think through a couple different ways that they might do this. They might do it through housing markets. They might do it through school district boundaries and where folks choose to settle. May do it through the fiscal conditions facing cities. That could mean that given the economic base and the tax base within these municipalities could be weaker, maybe the tax rates have to be very high, and then that discourages people from moving into the jurisdiction, just leaving a large tax burden on those who remain. Could also be service differentials in the quality or quantity of public services and amenities that can be offered. So lots of different ways, but it's really, no matter where you look on the map, especially acutely in the Midwest, though, you see this kind of coterminousness of persistent poverty and certain municipal boundaries. Economic disconnection too. Here we're looking at the county level for a moment, just because employment data is only available, quality employment data here is only available in a long time series at the county level. We see pretty clear evidence that persistent poverty counties are disconnected from broader national growth. Here we have going back to the very beginning of the County Business Patterns time series, we have employment levels normalized to 100 in 1986, and you can see the national economy has enjoyed very large employment growth over time. Since then, whereas persistent poverty counties have really kind of bumped along with slight modest growth, but in general stagnation. However, this idea of economic disconnection, though, also starts to fall apart when you, not fall apart, but get a little more complicated when you break things out by, these are the typologies of persistent poverty counties that I introduced earlier, where in the West, that tall orange line, we see that persistent poverty has coincided and existed alongside really rapid economic growth, far outpacing the nation itself. We see that kind of the brownish dark lines is tribal communities, predominantly in the West too. Those experienced pretty rapid and above average job growth up through the Great Recession, and then stagnation and decline since then. Then kind of the middle bunch of lines show persistent poverty in rural and eastern parts of the country. It's generally been characterized by stagnation more or less since the end of the 1990s, or since the year 2000. And then it's really when you just look at persistent poverty in legacy cities, this is generally across the Midwest and Northeast, and it's generally characterized by large shares of the African-American population living in these communities, very wound up in the history of segregation and deindustrialization, which occurred simultaneously in these locations. We see that persistent poverty is really marked by a total absence of growth over very long time horizons here at the county level. We'll return to more of this later, but the idea is that we still get persistent poverty coexisting alongside economic growth. So it means growth alone is not sufficient to solve the problem of persistent poverty. And the thesis, again, is because there are other ways in which populations, especially deeply disadvantaged populations, are disconnected from the growth that may be occurring around them. You can measure social disconnection as well, in large part thanks to the good people at Opportunity Insights and the team, Raj Chetty, Nathaniel Hendren, and all that have pioneered really phenomenal use of linked IRS data set in collaboration with a whole bunch of great people at the Census Bureau. So building on their work, we can see that 52% of persistent poverty counties fall into the bottom quintile for childhood economic connectedness of all counties, which means the children growing up in persistent poverty counties are generally growing up in places where low socioeconomic status families have very few friends and acquaintances from high socioeconomic status ones. So you have a degree of social disconnection that might play a role in perpetuating poverty. Connections are even sparser for adults. So 2/3 of persistent poverty counties fall into the bottom quintile for overall economic connectedness. And then 2/3 of persistent poverty counties also rank in the bottom quintile on exposure or again, the share of low socioeconomic status individuals, friends who are high socioeconomic status. And here, the scholars used Facebook data and Facebook connections to come up with these figures. So social disconnection means that residents of persistent poverty counties have much less access to the bridging capital that fosters upward mobility. Sociologists talk about bonding and bridging capital, where bonding is kind of the strength of social ties within a group, and bridging is the strength of social ties across groups. So I think in many persistent poverty communities, actually bonding social capital may be even stronger than it is in other types of communities. However, that bridging social capital, that especially for people growing up in disadvantaged backgrounds is so essential to achieving upward mobility, is much rarer. So threadbare social connections can help, partially play a role in explaining how communities remain poor even when the economy around them thrives. And now getting to maybe what most of you are here for, the good stuff, using LODES and LED data. We can also measure multidimensional disconnection through commuting patterns. Excuse me, quick water break. So commuting patterns are really a direct, information-rich measure of connectivity. They tell you where people work, where people live, where people work, the connection between them. So you end up with this segment of really the two most important economic spaces in an individual's life. And if you aggregate that up across a population, you can start to kind of see, to the extent, maybe people living in some communities are not involved in the predominant flows of economic and social life that define a metropolitan area, or kind of constitute maybe the economic mainstream of a community. So we used LEHD origin destination employment statistics for this to provide a direct measure of connectivity between tract pairs. Using R, and I have to give a shout out to my colleague Ben Glassner, who's an economist here at EIG, who really helped design and conceptualize this work for me. I kind of gave the problem statement, and he was instrumental in building the solution. And then we tabulated tract to tract commuting matrices, and you'll see in a few moments visualized pairwise flows with more than 100 commuters. So if you look at a city like Chicago, where each dot here represents the number of commuters into a tract, scaled by the number, and gray tracts are not persistently poor, bluish tracts are persistently poor. We can see that persistent poverty areas are generally, outside the predominant flows of economic life in the Chicago area, and this is really defined by north-south commutes into the central business district. There are a lot of plenty of commuters, of course, in persistent poverty communities. For sure, most adults are working. However, it's much more kind of fragmented, and again, it's kind of asymmetric to the predominant flows. And there are still, even saying that, there are still fewer outbound and inbound commuters in these in persistently poor census tracts. And again, they're underrepresented in commuting pairs, so they kind of have fewer strong pairs than they do destinations. And there's a later segment of the presentation that will explore these patterns for other metropolitan areas too, so we can see how this technique works well in some areas, and how and why it may not work as well in other areas. So put all this together, and the piece says that the negative impacts of disconnection and the results of it really call for a reconnection agenda as part of the policy toolkit to try to finally end this scourge of persistent poverty in the United States, because a country as prosperous as the United States should not have 34 million Americans living in communities that have not been able to rise out of poverty going on 40 years now. So some stylized facts from the analysis: growth alone is insufficient. As we saw in those employment charts, if there are too few connections between persistently poor communities and the people living in them, and the areas, sectors, and parts of a community that are growing, even if they're geographically abutting right next to each other. If those social and other ties are not strong enough, that growth may fail to help uplift persistently poor areas altogether. Also, no two persistent poverty areas are the same. This gets back to the initial map that the condition really does appear to be inseparable from the experience of particular people in a particular place facing particular challenges and unique circumstances that need to be overcome. And then no persistent poverty area suffers from a single challenge either. Generally, it's really complex, overlapping social and economic dynamics that serve to kind of perpetuate this condition in place and for people. So this calls for dual aims for policy. So one, to, in a place-based, very kind of locally tailored way, strengthen the local foundations for economic development. In other work that we've done for the Economic Development Administration, looking into how to advance economic development for persistently poor communities. Looking across the map, it became pretty clear also that you could identify one or two or three areas where this particular persistently poor place was really lagging, or like a couple threshold challenges or barriers that without solving that issue, it would be very hard for other pieces to fall into place. So a kind of a very calibrated approach to strengthening the local foundations to allow development and opportunity to flourish should be one aim for policy. And then two, fortifying ties between persistently poor and other left behind areas and the mainstream economy. There is so much that can be achieved if these ties are strong, or even if they exist at all, that we need to realize that disconnection is a lot of what sustains the divide. And in this era, now more than ever, we need to forge a reconnection agenda. So I think that can be take many different forms, right? It can take the form of infrastructure investment for a place that is literally disconnected in some deeply rural parts of Appalachia or the West. It can be internet and broadband connectivity to allow folks to get inroads to the digital economy. It can be at the school and individual level. It can be field trips. It can be peer-to-peer learning and experiences. It can be I think everything big to small has to be part of the solution set, again, to just break down the divides and extend and complete the restorative fabric of the U.S. economy. So this concludes kind of part one of the presentation. I'll get to part two in a moment. But again, if you'd like to dig deeper or read the full paper or read other papers in this set, I encourage you to go visit that. And then EIG, as I mentioned, also did a really deep dive on persistent poverty communities in the United States, including some case studies in St. Louis, Missouri, Bighorn County, Montana, Gadsden County, Florida, and one other one that's escaping me right now, and it includes a lot of analytics and other frameworks and some policy suggestions for how to think about doing what's on the slide, advancing economic development in persistent poverty communities. So returning to our measure of connectivity, since this is an LED webinar after all, wanted to just present a few different communities where this works well. Here, the visualization is a little different. We have all commuters. Excuse me. The dots represent any census tract or they're scaled to commuting size for all populations. So you have more dots on the map. But again, this shading between persistently poor and not persistently poor places are the same. You can see in a city such as Columbus, Ohio, you almost have this, I was trying to figure out how to describe it, but it's almost like a mesh basket, for lack of a better term, a characteristic of commuting patterns where the predominant ones are really suburb to suburb with a few commuting patterns to the core, but almost all of them are really between not persistently poor areas and other not persistently poor areas. And you really see very few thick lines connecting those blue persistently poor census tracts with employment centers and hubs. So that's just one measure of, again, how persistently poor areas are kind of apart from the social economic flows and mainstream of the economy there in Columbus, Ohio. And then in Washington, D.C., I think we're only visualizing lines that have at least 100 commuters in them. You have a whole bunch of commuters from kind of northwest quadrants and Capitol Hill parts of DC into the center. You have very few lines from really persistently poor parts of Southeast Washington, DC into kind of the core of employment and economic life in the DC area. Looking now at a couple more Sunbelt examples, Fort Worth, Texas, and Omaha, Nebraska. In Fort Worth, again, we see all sorts of very distant, in some cases, patterns, generally all of which bypass persistent poverty areas. Omaha, Nebraska is another good example where there is very deep segregation and deep persistent poverty in this Midwestern city. It's also very separate from very segregated, one of the most segregated cities in the country, including from employment centers, which are more in the center of the city. And again, very few strong ties from persistently poor areas to others. However, there start to be, some cases where if downtown is considered persistently poor and you're trying to kind of build up aggregate summary measures of the connectivity of persistently poor census tracts in an area, you end up, your analysis can end up getting a little muddied. So here, if you take the downtown tracts out, you again see very highly segregated, here in economic terms, patterns between persistently poor areas and not. Tulsa, Oklahoma is another one where, again, the predominant flows are kind of from the center to the southeast. Yet, again, if we were trying to aggregate some summary statistics, it might look that like persistent poverty census tracts in these two cities were actually quite connected. And then, it can really break down downtown in some other cases. Here, San Antonio is another tract where downtown and most census tracts adjacent to downtown do cross the persistent poverty threshold. And, starts to get me thinking, and we haven't done this in the research yet, it's really for future work for us to do, how can we maybe just remove the downtowns from this analysis without kind of destroying the delicate interconnections as we're trying to measure these pairs, because you are starting to capture something else when downtown is persistently poor, because often, that could just be a couple public housing projects or in some cases even universities and student housing that are rendering these places persistently poor. So you're not really doing a neighborhood sort of analysis. Even though, here you could see if downtown were not blue, it would be another very classic pattern that we saw from the other cities. And then finally, Portland, Oregon, really just drives this point home. It has just a handful of persistent poverty census tracts. Those it does have are part of downtown. So you end up with persistently poor census tracts appearing like they're the most connected corners of the region when we think that is, a poor proxy or measure for what's actually happening on the ground. So I'd say I kind of share this just to share the latest thinking with you and share some open questions. Would love to hear from or collaborate with anyone on kind of how to perfect this or keep adapting it, because I think it's really interesting and has a lot of potential. But those are some of the places we've observed that you really do need kind of local knowledge or to look at this on a case-by-case basis before you try to establish an empirical rule. And then finally, to close out, I think there's a really interesting policy application for this method that is front of mind for me because one of the things that we work on at EIG is the opportunity zones policy, which was just made permanent in the reconciliation bill. And governors are going to be called on, again, to designate, as per the policy and the statute, 1/4 of their qualifying low-income census tracts as opportunity zones. And last time around, when governors were first called to do this in 2017, when OZES was first passed, we ended up seeing a number of downtowns were designated as opportunity zones. We noticed that in general, across much of the country, downtown census tracts often do meet low income or persistent poverty criteria. And we thought, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could actually identify and provide governors with a kind of list of, okay, here are your downtown census tracts, so you can make more informed decisions. In some cases, in really struggling cities, you might want to nominate your downtowns as opportunity zones. In other cases, you might not want to, because you feel like the spirit and intent of the policy or incentive implies you should be designating different parts of your town as opportunity zones. So I think there's real value in knowing, in identifying these downtown tracts, these employment centers for this policy application that's coming down the pike here soon. And generally, I think we've seen on all these maps that the tracts with the most commuting pairs are almost always downtown or somehow or other, primary metropolitan employment centers. So this method can really be used to systematically identify those downtowns and employment centers where, resident-based measures of poverty or income might not accurately capture the economic condition or character of the area. And of course, removing downtowns would also take opportunity zones out or other policies out. It would also sharpen our measure of connectivity or disconnectivity. However, also don't want to overcomplicate things. So it could be that looking at this kind of measure of centrality doesn't necessarily tell us a heck of a lot more than a job to resident ratio that might be equally as effective as at identifying downtowns. But anyway, while I was digging into this question, I was trying to see if others had done this work in identifying downtowns with LODES and LED data, and came up pretty dry in the search engines. So did some poking around myself and wanted to share that here in the wider webinar. So with that, I'll I guess hand it back to Erlene to moderate some questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Kenan. Before we get to the questions, as a reminder, the presentation will be accessible on the Census Academy website at census.gov/academy under the webinar tab within 30 days. The link has been added to the chat. Again, please type all of your questions in the Q&A and keep your questions pertaining to the presentation. And now for the first question. How does the 2.2 chronic poverty rate derived from the 2013 through 2016 data compare to the more recent data?
That's a good question. And there I'm standing on the shoulders of giants that did that. It was a really good piece, which hopefully I can drop in the chat later and maybe include it in the recording. It's at least
Kenan,
cited
you're on mute. Can you
Okay.
please unmute?
Oh, am I on mute? Whoops. Yes, I'll unmute. Hold on.
Kenan, you're still on mute.
I'm still on mute. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay, got thumbs up. Yes, great. Okay, I'll bring the slide back up. So that, that statistic is, I can grab the link from the paper later. So it was from a special analysis that Census Bureau researchers did. I was surprised by the 2.2% number myself, actually. I found it was one of the most eye-opening things I had read in a long time. And again, I think it says nothing about the precarity of people bouncing in and out of poverty, people who have just slightly climbed above the poverty rate. So I think in all, it's probably a bit of an understatement of those who are maybe not are both subject to chronic poverty and chronic precarity. But yes, it's I think a powerful, and it teaches us a lot about the individual level experience of poverty. Now, I'd say the 2013 to 2016 period was a segment of, or was a period of decent but not fantastic economic growth. I would imagine, though, that if you look at the trend line that the national economy was on at the time, it was pretty similar to the trend line we've been on for the past 5 years, at least post-COVID or maybe 2021 onward. So I don't have informed reason to believe it's significantly different now. The U.S. poverty rate in general is lower, and that's some extent the after effect of all the pandemic stimulus and relief programs. But that's the extent of what I know about the current state on that right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenan. We fixed the technical problems on our side, so I can hear you now.
Okay, super.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Do you all have a map, Tableau, geographic visualization of the relevant census tracts?
We do have a visualization of the relevant census tracts. Yes, that we have two EIG resources that have different mapping interfaces. So the most recent is our Advancing Economic Development in Persistent Poverty Communities report. I'll put that up here in case anyone wants to Google. And there we do have a map that looks at persistent poverty counties and persistent poverty tract groups. Kind of clusters of persistent poverty census tracts across the country. We also have a couple years prior to that, it was work that really motivated this deeper dive with EDA. We did a neighborhood poverty project that looked at going back to 1980 as well. I believe could have been 1990, but looked at, no, it was 80, sorry. The kind of evolution of census tracts over time, including those that were persistently poor that were poor in 1980. We saw like how many actually, quote unquote, turned around or at least registered a significantly lower poverty rate by the time we did that analysis in 2018. And it was something like only 14% of census tracts that were high poverty in 1980 were actually low poverty come 2018. A large chunk of those were in New York City, and a number of others were downtown and kind of places that had really changed fundamentally in character over time. So that I think that is kind of different complementary work, and it also speaks to just how rare really meaningful turnarounds are at the neighborhood level across way too much of the country. And I will put a plug in for more census researchers who also published an authoritative census list of persistent poverty census tracts around the same time we published this. So I think it would have been 2023 that was likely published. And this was it was a big work for them. It was big work for us too, because of course census tract boundaries change with every decennial census. So it's a real laborious crosswalk exercise to kind of create consistent geographic longitudinal census tract boundaries. But we did it, and the Census Bureau did it really almost in parallel as well. So that's a good resource. And if you want an official both kind of spreadsheet, an official Census Bureau source to cite on persistent poverty census tracts, I would encourage you to check that out.
Great map. Where can we access it?
Okay, yeah, same. Just Google EIG, Advancing Economic Development in Persistent Poverty Communities, and there's an interactive map blurb there.
A statement. Thanks for continuing to include county level data since that's needed to match other data sets that go by county, such as nationwide county health rankings.
Yes, absolutely. No, and there's real value. Like I think of looking at, so I don't want to totally dismiss counties either, because counties are a very relevant geography in American life, and especially in rural areas. If you're thinking of schools, if you're thinking of all sorts of administration and services, and if you're even thinking of like who wields a lever, census tracts don't wield any policy levers, but counties do. So it's really I think like that. It's absolutely a legitimate lens with which to look at this problem. And I think of not one tier as any better or worse than the other, but you're really looking into a microscope, right, at different resolutions, and you're seeing different patterns and different truths at the different scales you're looking at. So looking at the county level, you see one geography of persistent poverty. Looking at the census tract, you see another. I think more information comes into focus at the census tract level, but the county level, again, has its own truths and its own imperatives as well, and its own ease of crosswalking with other data.
I have initiated a working group looking specifically at unincorporated areas, primarily in the frontier and remote areas. It is difficult to find any data if the data is not a CDP. Please recommend resources and/or a TA. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, in general, gosh, I'd say let me think about that and follow up too. I'd say, the Census Bureau is my go-to all the time and they didn't invite me just to cheerlead the Census Bureau, by the way. There are, yes, just so many different data sets and a lot of rich texture at the census or at the county level provided by, a whole range of Census Bureau products. I think the Bureau of Economic Analysis also has some very useful county level measures of like income and I think it's been discontinued now, but even participation and income derived from government transfer programs. And let's see, there are, I think the CDC, it's like IHCME, it's like Institute for County Health Metrics, has a lot of useful county health information, which is it's a university collaboration, I think. So there are resources out there, but I'd say please, let me put up my email again. Please feel free to email me, and I'd be happy with a question again, and I'd be happy to share some directly.
The next question pertains to slide number 6. Wonderful map, especially for Oklahoma. Is it available?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, this map is available. It's available in the report. It's available to use and replicate, and I believe you can download it or see it kind of just as is on the interactive on our website too. I believe it's a similar format. But again, you can also get in touch with me if you can't find an image that fits your purposes. Thanks.
Does this analysis rely on official or supplemental poverty measures? Is it possible to toggle between?
So this only relies on official poverty measures. And yeah, that comes with its own limitations, of course, right? The supplemental poverty measure, I think, is a more accurate, provides a more accurate assessment of material need today, and it shows that poverty is worse in some places, better in others, based on prevailing incomes, based on public benefits that people receive, etc. And the real limitation, though, is that the supplemental poverty measure doesn't have the geographic detail or the time series, the longitudinal detail that we need to do this sort of like really long-term decade-based analysis going back to the 1980s or the 1990s to get a sense of the whole arc of places. So we kind of consciously did not use the supplemental poverty measure in this work, despite admiring it and thinking it's extremely valuable and in many ways complementary to this. But those are the reasons why it was really we needed that granularity and that long-term look.
Thanks for including analysis by tribal populations/areas. It's important for Oklahoma.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the the challenge of persistent poverty in native communities, on native lands, is particularly acute. And there's a whole additional set of invisible barriers and dimensions of disconnection that are I think part of the challenge, right? You have you have sometimes different legal practices, different like land rights, very different assessment of how people should engage economically. That goes down to people's kind of social and spiritual bones. And you don't, I think, especially in tribal communities, you don't want a reconnection agenda, as I called it, to at all result in a dilution of identity or anything than that. So I think thanks for the comment. Glad to talk more. But yeah, it is one of the biggest challenges, because I think the persistence of poverty in on native lands is I think a testament to a lot of national policy failure, but at the same time, it is a huge challenge, and we need more people thinking about it. So I'll stop there, but I'm glad it was of interest, and I hope that it sparks further engagement, experimentation, and problem solving with Native communities to bend the arc there into positive direction as well.
Wouldn't out-migration tend to reinforce localized poverty because those with greater ambition and other positive attributes tend to leave a high poverty area in search of greater opportunities, thereby leaving their home area more impoverished? How and why does out-migration tend to level all areas?
Yeah, good question. And I think the question actually speaks to the reality in practice. So the theory would be that after a place declines, maybe it has more people than it has jobs. So perhaps eventually things would come into balance. You get a population that more matches the employment opportunities locally, and then that would be a more stable equilibrium for a community that might not result in the poverty as persistent as it is. In reality, you're right. It's often there's kind of a selection bias in who migrates out, who leaves. The act of out-migration itself in population loss makes a community a less attractive place to invest or start a business or open a new plant anyway, because the labor force is shrinking, and there are many other parts of the country where it's growing. So there are lots of headwinds that start to, I think, in reality, make it harder for places that start to begin population loss to turn around. But the theory was that out-migration would help a place reach a stable equilibrium, and I think that's not the case. Not what has happened.
Nice descriptors of threadbare connections, sparse connections, wording that can be used with the general public.
Thank you. Trying to make it accessible. Yes.
Okay, next question. Going back to the beginning themes, were there any exploration of geographies waiting for different rates of minimum wage?
There was no waiting for different rates of minimum wage. No. I'd say, we kind of kept, this is really solely based on the standard national poverty rate. Again, in various work that I cited and the other projects that I've mentioned, we do additional crosswalks and layer things on, but the base of this analysis is just the poverty rate. I will say though that, and I think as the findings in the narrative has alluded, generally, like so many things break along the same gradient. Like if you do have a place that is persistently poor, chances are it is also losing population. Chances are, it is, doing worse than a place maybe in the same state that has the same minimum wage law, but is not as distressed on a couple different measures as the kind of county in question. So I think, adding some of those policies on, yes, would maybe in some ways account for phenomenon or places being considered persistently poor on the margin. But in general, there's so much consistence that I'd say that doing something like that wouldn't change the overall picture here. And even like if you go look at educational attainment, if you look at life expectancy or other health outcomes, you're going to often see a very similar map to this of where things run lowest. So I'd say, it's usually when we're talking about persistently poor and we're looking at, even for all its faults, places that have been above, a 20% national poverty rate for 30 or 40 years, we're talking about genuine disadvantage, and kind of how you tweak the numbers don't change the overall picture.
Could you share the data source example web services shapefiles used in the map you shared earlier that displays counties with proportional symbols for persistent poverty?
Yes, I think so. Pointed to that online. I have to go back and see. So please, person who asked the question, feel free to email me. I'm blanking right now on what program we exactly made this in, but we definitely have the data, and yes, would be happy to share.
You mentioned bridging. Since a person's economic situation is so dependent on one's ethnicity, race, what impact, if any, do you anticipate if HUD rescinds its affirmatively furthering fair housing and affirmative fair housing marketing plan requirements?
That's a good question. Let's see. I mean, first, yeah, agree with the premise that, especially if you combine race with place, you have a lot of the kind of summary statistics of how one's going to be or of what an individual's experience in the American economy looks like. To the fair housing question, I read a lot about the literature on kind of where housing's built, on mixed income neighborhoods, et cetera. And it does seem that, especially as data has improved and analysis has improved with big data sets in recent years, we do find that mixed income neighborhoods are better for folks from disadvantaged backgrounds and children growing up in low income households than any sort of economically segregated neighborhoods. Think that we know and we've learned that putting affordable housing units not just kind of in completely separate buildings, but integrated into apartment buildings or interspersed with housing that's more workforce or market rate is also strong and useful and positive for engendering more economic opportunity and upward mobility. But it's hard work, and it's hard to see the impact. Like how do you quantify a child's experience walking down the street, or who one runs into? Does it, I don't know if going to a more mixed race, mixed income grocery store meaningfully makes one today feel like they've built stronger social and bridging ties. But I think in the background, all this stuff though really does work, and does if you take a moment and think, well, is economic, social, and racial segregation in any way positive for the outcomes we wish to see in the society we wish to build? I think the answer is clearly negative. So I then put faith in the opposite, in the positive, that even if the output or impacts of really small measures of mixing and kind of restoring ties and building connections individually, they might not feel that significant. I think the whole has to be, and we have to think that as we kind of consider individuals' entire livelihoods and opportunity sets, and those of the places we call home.
Could scales for distance be added to the maps, to give a sense of how far residents are traveling?
Scales could be. Yes, I think they could be. That's a good question. Yeah, those were all cities, not counties. And of course, the cities are different sizes, and some cities are very wonkily bounded today. But yeah, those that's a good question. I think we could figure that out.
Is the poverty connectivity measure available for all MSAs? Example, I'm in Medford, Oregon.
Is the poverty what measure?
Connectivity, poverty connectivity.
So we have data, and again, the Census Bureau data has data too for kind of all persistent poverty counties and census tracts in the country. Yeah, so that data is available. I'd say, yes, so we should have that for Medford, Oregon, either at the census tract or county level. So yes. But I don't know if I don't think it'll be part of kind of the webinar delivery. I'd suggest please getting in touch separately.
Does LODES data take into account use of various non-personal vehicle transportation?
It should, yeah. I mean, my understanding is that the LODES is based on the address, the home address and the work address of a person, not really the mode of transportation used to get between A and B.
Thanks for including Tulsa about map on slide 6. The southeast area of Oklahoma is marked tribal, but it may be an extension of Deep South. That region of southeast Oklahoma is historically known as Little Dixie.
Yes, yeah, that may be one of the regions where it's perilous to try to characterize, based on which groups are disproportionately represented where. But again, as I mentioned, I think it's still important to do because you can't, deny how inextricably linked, race and place and poverty are when we're talking about persistent poverty communities today. And yeah, my understanding of that corner of Oklahoma is that maybe it's quite mixed. It is very southern. It is home to a couple different tribal nations, and I believe almost all that land that's covered there is owned by tribal nations, but not exclusive by any means. And I think there are, in many ways economically too, it probably more resembles the kind of rural agricultural South than it does the more arid kind of open plains based kind of agriculture and topography of the tribal communities in the rest of the West. So thank you. Yeah, very fair comment.
Did you examine the larger Chicagoland area? There are probably several areas of persistent poverty in Chicago's suburbs, Bourbon, Robbins, etc. And there is a strong suburb to suburb commuting pattern in its larger metro area.
There is, yes. So in the data resources I mentioned, any and the maps that we have on our website, and believe any persistent poverty census tract or group of census tracts will be visible on that. And all these, if you look closely around Chicagoland, there are lots of little dots there. I think each one of those will be a different municipality, in addition to the big Cook County one. We did not do the commuting maps outside of city boundaries, in part because our computers were getting very tired. That it was a lot of data calculation. So in order to scope it to something that didn't just eat up too much bandwidth at the time, we only looked within cities, and to recognize, yes, that has its own shortcomings, and in many ways is going to miss other really significant commuting patterns in the metropolitan region.
Any thoughts on how whether these trends are evident in smaller cities, such as those with a population between 100,000 and 250,000?
Mm-hmm. I mean, they are definitely and absolutely relevant and present. I think especially in the smaller and mid-sized cities of the Midwest and the South. So they're in many ways, I think the challenges are similar. They may also be facing more challenges in just in not being kind of left behind entirely with if they're contending with broader deindustrialization or factory closures or the decline of manufacturing. It could be that persistent poverty in an area also coexists with broader struggles in the smaller mid-sized region. So that's I think that many of the different dynamics at play in bigger cities are going to be at play in local cities here too. In some ways, maybe they have, maybe they're able to make more inroads against the problem too, where smaller cities may have tighter knit civic communities, may have community foundations or other actors that are able to and whose mission is to try to revitalize and spread economic and social health throughout the region. And when you're maybe not dealing with a persistent poverty cluster of 200,000 people living in 100 different census tracts in Chicago, you're dealing with 5 to 10 census tracts and maybe 25,000 people in a smaller city like Warren, Ohio. the problem may feel a little more tractable, or you may be able to start to achieve results, meaningful results on the ground in a way that some larger cities where just the scale of the disadvantage is also harder to surmount. So happy to talk more about that too, but those were some quick reactions and observations for small, mid-sized areas.
Downtown tracts are poor. Will that replicate the problems associated with the urban renewal programs?
Let's see. Will downtown census tracts being poor replicate the problems associated with urban renewal programs? I think, well, there are lots of problems associated with urban renewal programs. In part, because they I mean, if you can look at kind of they engender disconnectivity in a very ironic's not the right term, but they were helping to connect, those some of those commuting patterns that we saw, the suburbs and outlying areas with the downtown, while severing the connections of communities that it passed through, right? So, those could have been labeled connectivity interventions when they were anything but for the communities that they passed through and pointedly did not connect or disconnected. So I think that's a warning about how one goes, goes about any sort of agenda to address the problem. We've tried things that have not worked and in some ways have done even more damage in the past. I think, downtown census tracts, I'd say more there, the data, just because fine-grained geographic data like census tract scale just gets very idiosyncratic from place to place. So I think when you're looking at downtown and downtown adjacent neighborhoods and communities, you really do just have to go local. If you're doing local work, those areas in your communities, and kind of how the fabric fits together, and whether downtown is separate from the neighborhoods surrounding it, or whether it is. Whether it's kind of more, there's more of a kind of gradient from downtown into real residences where people live and work. In general, though, I kind of think of downtowns as less relevant for me in my work here, because I care more about neighborhoods, right, and where people actually live. I kind of view often downtowns registering as more as statistical anomalies or something different from the problem of really deeply entrenched neighborhood poverties kind of in the neighborhoods where people actually live. Thanks.
So if downtowns are removed, what will be the replacement? And what will happen to the existing downtowns?
So by downtowns being removed, I meant being removed from my analysis of like pairs, just to be clear. I don't, not like actually getting rid of downtowns in the United States. I don't know if that was miscommunication or not. So in the analysis, I think I guess the problem, or maybe they should be a separate category entirely, could be better, because we don't want to, I'm thinking in real time here, we wouldn't want to necessarily lose the information embedded with those commuting flows being like those are the most numerous out there. So removing downtowns entirely could distort the picture, but I feel like they should at least not be considered persistently poor, because again, if you're trying to derive a summary statistic, you're really not capturing the experience of the neighborhood, because chances are there are very few people who actually live in those downtowns. So I guess we should have this conversation before I made the slides. I'd recommend maybe counting those tracts as something else and see how the pattern starts to look after that.
Would it be possible to apply this in counties that are designated rural, where a large metro area may not be available and the county may not meet persistently poor criteria, but has a higher than national average of poverty rate?
So that I'll say, let's see, if I assume that one may be talking about like qualifying for opportunity zone status, because like any place that has a high enough poverty rate or a low enough income is considered high poverty or low income community by standard federal definitions, or would show up on these lists of persistent poverty areas. But for purposes of of opportunity zones and the policy scenario that I was laying out there at the end, if that's the genesis of the question, because I didn't see when it came through, I'd say once governors are called on, so this just passed last week, July 4th, right? And it'll call on governors to designate another round of opportunity zones sometime next year, likely. And the Treasury Department will put out a list of qualifying areas based on the criteria in the statute. And census tracts are what qualify, and all counties also have census tracts. And there are, the new bill did include actually deeper and more generous opportunity zones incentives for investments going into rural areas. So kind of governors have even more impetus to maybe look for rural areas to designate opportunity zones when the time comes. So again, happy to talk with someone separately offline on that. But there will be kind of authoritative maps and kind of calls for census tract nominations for opportunity zones once the policy gets further down the pike towards implementation. Thanks.
And then this is Erlene.
Yes.
We have several more questions, so we're just going to take one more. And what's going to happen is we're going to send all these questions to you, and then you can answer them individually.
Okay.
And then we'll post it on the website, and you can answer them, and then we'll post it on the website. Okay?
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, the last question. Have persistently poor places been able to transition out of that status? What worked?
Oh, that's the big question. Yeah, and I really, really wish I had a better answer because, and that's one of the reasons, I've dedicated a big chunk of my career here to studying this. True kind of turnarounds are really few and far between. In the EDA report, Advancing Economic Development in Persistent Poverty Communities, we talk, there's a section that talks about this. At the county level, most places that have risen out of persistent poverty did so, if they're rural, they did so because of mining or, oil and gas extraction and kind of that boom that happened here recently. Or over the past, especially since 2010. So that's so oil and gas extraction and generally natural resources extraction, which is itself, extractive in multiple senses of the word often, and has almost had places like they've grown out of persistent poverty status because they've had new people move in, maybe more than they've actually had poor populations rise out of poverty. But that's like a large chunk of the places that were high poverty historically and are no longer now by count, especially rural counties. Another set, similarly kind of unsatisfying, would be ex-urban areas, again, that have grown through metropolitan sprawl and more kind of population growth diluting the adding to the denominator, so diluting, say, the numerator or the number of people in persistent poverty in the county. Of course, as metropolitan areas grow and sprawl, maybe folks who were poor on the fringes are able to find new opportunities in a growing metropolitan area. We haven't studied that, but in general, around the fringes of especially sprawling southern metropolitan areas, you also are going to find the counties that fell out of persistent poverty, and that's going to predominantly have been driven by population growth. There's one county one county north of Jackson, Mississippi, I believe Madison County, Mississippi, that seems to be, from my work, like one of the best examples of kind of organic climbing out of persistent poverty status through economic development. This county welcomed a very large Nissan plant, Nissan's big manufacturing plant in Canton, Mississippi, I believe, a couple decades ago now. And it seems to have really grown, developed, built a community around it. And you can see the number of people in poverty, the number of African Americans in poverty, has all gone down to an absolute term. So it's not just a story of kind of growth through the arrival of the plant and being on the periphery of Jackson, but it seems to be kind of more organic economic development. I would love to do a deeper case study on it. I have not had the chance yet, but I'd say that's the best example that I know. There are kind of individual neighborhood examples around too. I don't want to keep going too long though, but this is a really frustrating question that is, it's everything, right? It's like the whole reason that we're doing this. We need case studies and models to build off of. So I would also love it if anyone has any favorite case studies or places that they think really could tell a story of organic, meaningful turnaround. That'd be very useful, because even at the census tract level, it's hard to find one where it's not kind of a pretty ambiguous case of like, oh, well, is this gentrification or is this an organic turnaround? And that ambiguity is a whole separate conversation, but I'd love to learn from this group on like really what the purest best examples are, so we can elevate them and learn from them. Thanks.
Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you so much. We apologize that we weren't able to get to everybody's questions. We're running 20 minutes behind. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to Kenan for his wonderful presentation. Kenan, would you like to make any closing remarks?
No closing remarks. No, well, just thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it a lot. I will actually, while I'm here, and before people go, I will drop a link into to the full article in the chat because it's the author link where it's you don't have to go behind the paywall. So I will put this here. Hopefully, interested folks can get it, or it'll be in the follow-up. And thank you for all the claps. Really, appreciate that. Thanks, everyone.
Well, this concludes the July LED webinar. Join us next month on August 27th when Keith Hayward and Raza Lamb present Extract, Analyze, and Visualize Loads from the LED extraction tool. I also want to invite you to our 2025 Local Employment Dynamics Partnership Hybrid Workshop on September 3rd through the 4th from noon to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. I added it to the chat. Our keynote speaker will be Sarah Banna, who will speak on labor market effects of generative AI evidence from software developers. Just to let you know, Kenan was also one of our speakers from 2024. So if you want to go back and look at his presentation from 2024, it is sitting in our workshop tab. So upon exiting this webinar, you will receive a pop-up to an evaluation. We would appreciate that you take the time to answer the questions so we may better serve you with future webinars. Until then, on behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
This webinar is over. You may disconnect at this time. Have a good afternoon, everyone.